In this presentation, I will address the fundamentals and terminology that you need to understand in order to properly conduct survey research. The several topics that we're going to go over, including whether to use customer standardized surveys. We will discuss differences between sample or census surveys, the length of the survey and importance, challenges, and such. Item and scale design, anchors and labels, grouping of items associated with individual factors, negative wording, demographics, timing, and finally what to do with the results. So first, let's begin by discussing customized or standardized surveys. Customized surveys are especially important for organizations that want to survey employees, for instance, regarding their vision, maybe attitudes associated specifically with that organization and with something going on with that organization. However, if the attitudes consist of something more general, such as job satisfaction, then a standardized test would be more appropriate. Also, customized surveys can be costly, so that's something to consider. And finally, customized surveys, similar to the vision and mission, they can be more consistent with company values with perhaps a standardized measure. The sample survey or census survey differences. A sample survey will take a sample of the entire organization. So for instance, if there are 500 employees, perhaps a sample of 50 employees is taken from that greater population. A census survey, however, is the entire organization. All the employees in the entire organization have an opportunity to complete a survey. The reasons, the justification for the survey, and so on would dictate whether to use a sample or census survey. For example, if let's say leadership wants to take kind of a general temperature of job satisfaction and the organization consists of 10,000 employees, well, it may be impractical, unnecessary, too costly to do a census survey. Therefore, just a survey of a sample of employees would be more appropriate. So the employee population size is important to consider. It's also important that if sampling or census is, if you're determining which one should be used, that the individuals involved in that decision making should be knowledgeable about sampling, because if they're making a decision between the two and they decide, for instance, to do a sample survey, then there are many factors to consider, which we will not get into here. However, consider the demographics. If it's a very diverse organization, if it's a global organization, then how many employees are we going to sample from maybe each location, and so on. This will also contribute to margin of error because, for instance, if there's 10,000 employees and only 10 are sampled, then obviously there's a larger margin of error that occurs, and these values should be reported. Many times just the statistical values may be difficult to understand, so therefore it should also be properly explained to employees. We will discuss at the end of this presentation how the data is communicated to employees. Confidence interval reporting, similar to margin of error. We want to basically explain this information, have someone knowledgeable that can interpret it, and then of course explain it to the employees. Because ultimately this will impact employees' impressions and have an impact on the organization. For instance, if we conduct a sample survey, and employees will learn, because employees will learn that some people were surveyed, others weren't, well, then that can perhaps leave a negative impression because some employees may feel left out or discriminated against or something. And that can have a negative impact on the organization, even though let's say the people doing the surveying had great intentions of improving benefits or something. So a good lesson to learn here is that there are many factors to be considered that often perhaps are not. but if they are, then a survey can be much more effective. The length of a survey is important to understand because, for instance, if you want to increase the response rate and completion rate, then perhaps a survey that is extremely long may have a negative impact on both of those. So in other words, response rate, we are concerned about the number of individuals that will reply to the survey. And then once they begin to take the survey, now we have to consider completion rate. Is it too long? Are they going to perhaps complete only 20% of the survey and get tired of it for some reason because it's going on, and then they do not finish? So response rate, completion rate, two important factors to consider. Also, the relationship between the research scientist, the administrators of the survey, and the participants or potential participants. For example, if it is a generic survey, so let's say like a political poll or something like that, where there is no connection whatsoever between the researchers and the participants, then we can count on response rate and completion rate being much, much lower. However, if there is some form of relationship between the researchers and the participants, then that begins to increase. So, for example, if the company leadership is conducting a survey versus just general population, then of course now there's this sort of relationship, and especially if it's a trusting relationship. So if the president of an organization announces that a survey is going to be conducted and there's a high level of trust, then there's a good chance that the response and completion rate will improve. At a more, let's say, micro level, if a manager, let's say of 50 people, is going to be conducting a survey, and if they're properly communicating the intentions of the survey and so on, and further improve the trust of the followers, then you can even approach maybe perhaps a 100% completion rate. Also, the impact of the survey should, again, this is so important, should be explained, why it's going to be used, what the impact will be, not just on the organization, but on the individuals that are actually taking the survey. This is part of the administration process, and then once administration of that survey begins, there's also other things to consider. Is it an online survey? Is it perhaps administered during a meeting where coffee and donuts are being offered as maybe a little incentive to stick around after a meeting to complete the survey? And then, of course, we want to, before we even begin to administer that survey, we should consider what is the minimum amount of participants that are needed in order to complete the survey. And that can be done statistically. And then for others who there are others that may be administering a survey that do not understand how to compute that, then at least logically. So for example, if there are 100 employees and only, let's say, 2 or 3 or 5 end up taking that survey, then logically that will not be enough to represent the overall employee population. Item and scale design is, there's a lot to consider. We will discuss a few of those things. For instance, are the items or the question statements that are being asked or displayed, are they easily understood, or are they confusing to the participants? Are they double-barreled, meaning are the items asking more than one thing? Are they saying, is your manager a good communicator, as well as do they show up on time? Well, those are two different things. And if it's part of one item, then that's considered a double-barreled question and can lead to unreliable results. The scale midpoint, for instance, having something that says, let's say, not sure in the middle. In the examples to the right, you see here where there's this continuum, and the scale midpoint is no opinion. Well, is it part of a continuum? Does it make sense? For instance, in this example again of this continuum, it goes from disagree to somewhat disagree to no opinion to somewhat agree to agree. It makes sense, it makes logical sense, and it has this flow in this continuum. Also, if it is not part of the continuum, so in the second example, it goes from disagree to somewhat disagree to do not know, and then somewhat agree and agree. Well, now if you look carefully, this does not make logical sense, because do not know may mean they do not know, let's say, all of the facts that are part of this survey item, this question. And so therefore, to have when it's being scored, to have a 3 may be deceiving, because a 3 shows that individuals do not agree or necessarily do not disagree or agree. However, in this case, do not know. Perhaps if people scoring the 3 here, that would throw the results off. So maybe this should be just something that is not even included. If someone doesn't know, perhaps it should be like these last 3 examples we have where it's non-applicable, other, or simply do not know. In other words, they have an option. So in this case, you would use the continuum: disagree, somewhat disagree, no opinion, somewhat agree, agree, but then also add other options. Not applicable, perhaps the item doesn't apply to the person's position or their department. Other, where there may be another option that the researcher has not considered, so they could write that in. It could be open-ended item where they can respond with a description. And then finally, do not know, that there may be a lack of information, which in and of itself, by having a do not know option, could also yield very valuable data. It could show that there's improper communication or a lack of communication or something of that nature. Also, when you're considering the anchors and the labels that are used, there's research that kind of goes both ways sometimes. However, in general, there's some agreement that, for instance, if a survey is looking at something like customer satisfaction, then you would want to have lower numbers being lower level of satisfaction, higher numbers being higher levels of satisfaction. Also, labels that are consistent, that are not perhaps leading in one direction or another. And then in the examples here, I've also included images, which can be very helpful, especially if perhaps you're a global organization and there is multiple languages being spoken. So these types of images can be more universal and more understood. Also, in the image in the upper right, you will notice that not only are numeric values used, but here again, images that can be very easily understood, along with labels that have, as we mentioned before, are along a continuum. So for the most part, it's these what you consider like ordinal categories flow, where it doesn't go from no pain to little pain to all of a sudden severe pain and make a big jump. So it goes no pain, mild, moderate, severe, very severe, and then worst pain possible. Some other examples, some of the debate, there's some debate whether there should be anchors with labels throughout the entire Likert scale, or perhaps just on the ends. So in the first example, anchors with labels would be disagree, somewhat disagree, do not know, agree, or somewhat agree and agree. However, if you have labels and anchors, labels just at the ends, like completely disagree or completely agree, as in the second example, then it's recommended that you use a more, I guess we could say, like extreme description. So completely disagree, not just disagree, but completely disagree and completely agree. And then finally, there's also research will suggest that if you want to perhaps use what's called a bipolar scale, where rather than, let's say on a 7-point Likert scale, having values from 1 to 7, when you have something like disagree, which is sort of a negative thing, well then perhaps you have negative values. So in this case, if you completely disagree, you'd have a -3 versus a 1, which may make logical sense. Grouping items is also something to consider. Research will show that if you want to address common bias, this common basis of grouping and response set bias, then there's a number of things we can do. So for first of all, response set bias would mean that if you're addressing the same, let's say addressing 5 concepts for job satisfaction, and the first one is satisfaction of pay. Research will show that if you have the first 5 items that only address pay, response set bias could occur where the person just selects the same value very quickly because they see it's addressing the same thing. However, if the items are mixed up, so it goes from pay to the boss to the benefits and then back again, that can lead to other problems. So this is something to consider, and it depends perhaps on the number of items again, and what you're doing, and how you're displaying the information, and so on, including it's recommended that to help address this response set bias, you could use vague headings. So for instance, rather than saying job satisfaction, perhaps it says something like just, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe there's like attitudes towards a job. Of course, that might also impact the employees in other ways. So another example might be career plans instead of turnover intent. So that is just something to consider. And then lastly, communication. How you are communicating this survey, how it's going to be used. Perhaps really emphasize the vision and the values that you're trying to meet for the overall organization and the priorities. And so that way, before individuals even begin to complete a survey, they are hopefully more likely to answer in an honest manner. Negatively worded items. What this means is if you have, let's say on job satisfaction, where it's addressing how satisfied you are with pay, how satisfied you are with your manager, and then all of a sudden you would have an item that is negatively worded. So how dissatisfied are you with your manager, or something of that nature, with the idea being that if all of the items are consistently, let's say, going one direction, positive direction, that someone can simply stop thinking about what is being asked, and you may get more accurate responses if you switch around. But there's also research that will show that this may confuse the individual. The individuals may be more resistant to take the survey because they may think they're being manipulated. They may think that perhaps that they're somehow being tricked or something like that. Another recommendation would be having a short survey. So this can also help with some of the response bias and so on. All right, continuing along, demographics. This is very interesting because many times surveys will have the demographics right away at the beginning. However, there is research that will show that putting demographics at the end of a survey can be more effective for several reasons. First off, you can help avoid bias, because if you have the demographics at the beginning, perhaps individuals begin to immediately think something about that survey and the direction that maybe is preferred answers, or it may somehow impact them at a more emotional level, because if it's asking what their gender is, or what their race is, or what department they work in, or something of that nature. You want to ensure people that are participating that it's anonymous. You want to try to develop trust, so that way individuals are more likely to not only answer all of the items at the beginning, but then also once it gets into the demographic items, that they answer that honestly as best as they can as well. So that explanation of the uses of this survey and how the results will be used and communicated later on is very important. And then it's also recommended that perhaps make demographic questions optional. Timing of a survey is something that oftentimes individuals fail to recognize. For instance, if a survey is needed and is quickly put together and administered, and then unfortunately maybe it's done, let's say around holidays, or maybe a time of year when individuals are on vacation, such as maybe schools, and the survey is administered, let's say right before a summer vacation or something of that nature. well then people may be more resistant to take it because they're in a hurry. Maybe they're not even simply available. Also, you can coordinate the timing of a survey around the business cycle. So, for instance, if the organization has pay raises and annual reviews and things of that nature at a certain time of year, then there can be pros and cons of administering a survey depending what it's about before or after, let's say, those performance appraisals. Also, quarterly segmented sampling, where perhaps once a year, let's say there is, remember earlier we talked about a couple different ways of sampling, whether it's a census of the entire organization or a smaller sample. So it could be that quarterly you take a smaller sample from the overall employee population, and then maybe once a year it's that maybe a bit more costly but much more comprehensive census sample. And then finally, are there major changes expected? There's pros and cons here. So in other words, if there is let's say a company merger that is expected, and you do let's say a job satisfaction survey before that, well, that could dramatically change once the merger takes place, because now there's perhaps many more employees and you want to survey everybody in the organization. But also that could be a benefit, because then you're able to compare job satisfaction, let's say before a merger and after, which could also have value. So it's something to consider if major changes are expected within the organization. Once the data is collected and results are determined, then you can decide on, well, do we want to compare to other populations? So in other words, job satisfaction of our organization versus, let's say, maybe a national average. However, if you compare to a national average, is that really what you want? So in other words, do you want to be an average organization? You also want to consider, well, are we comparing apples to oranges? In other words, are we comparing, if we are in the insurance industry and we're comparing to norms in the healthcare industry, well, is that really a legitimate comparison? Perhaps we should be comparing within the same industry. And then what is recommended is perhaps benchmarking. So in other words, calculating where you want to be. Perhaps it is the first survey that's conducted, let's say, in job satisfaction, and you then in turn create a benchmark. So then a year later, then you resurvey the employees, look at their level of job satisfaction, and see where you are compared to that benchmark, where you are from the previous year, and are you achieving that benchmark, and if not, what do we need to do about it? Finally, the results of a survey, it's so important to communicate those results and communicate them effectively in a meaningful way. There are so many times that we've seen where data is collected from a survey and employees never know the results. This can be, in order to do this effectively, it can be done, let's say, at a company meeting. So perhaps a general overall meeting of the organization where the CEO announces some of the results, and then perhaps communicated again in a team meeting where some of these things are addressed at a smaller level, where there can be more interaction, question, answer, and so on, or even possibly even a newsletter, a blog, or something of that nature, where some of this information is very quickly disseminated and then perhaps updated through time to say, hey, we were addressing job satisfaction in a survey that's done at the company meeting. Employees are talked to at a more micro level with managers regarding some of the results and how they can be improved. And then maybe a newsletter follows up on a monthly basis addressing job satisfaction and what's being done about it. By doing this, now all of a sudden what you've done is taken what might be just sort of a general survey that employees aren't really that excited about taking because of bad experiences to something that they're really engaged with and they see as true value. When you're transparent with the results, whether they be good or bad, also that helps improve trust, which again can impact the next time you do a survey. Oftentimes, a survey will be conducted without considering the next time it's going to be done. So therefore, maybe trust is lost, nothing occurs. Let's say if it is job satisfaction and it's asked what kind of, let's say, benefits will help improve employees' experiences and how satisfied they are. Well, if nothing is ever done about that, or at least communicated if it's not being done because maybe there's not enough money in the budget or something, well then again, trust is lost, and that could dramatically impact the participation rate the next time around. So that was a lot of information to take in. What we addressed today is differences between customized or standardized survey, sample census, the length, item and scale design, anchors, labels, grouping, negative wording, demographics, and then finally the timing of the administration of a survey and what to do with those results. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned a lot about some of these basics of survey design and administration.